Over the last decade, it feels like single prize decks haven't really been in the best spot as far as the tier list goes. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely been some good single prize decks, even great ones I would say over the last 10 years, but for the most part, it never really felt like these decks had what it takes to actually win the World Championship. And as we head into the World Championships for 2026, Dragapult is the clear contender as the best deck in the format. There's multiple variants of it that are the best decks in the format currently, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that it's best positioned to win the World Championships. When you look at Worlds from a couple of years ago, Iron Thorns managed to win the entire thing up against Roaring Moon EX, and these are both decks that really weren't seen as major contenders for Worlds. They were on the radar, but did people really think they were going to win, make top 8 or even top 32? Not really. And as we look at the meta right now, we're kind of in a similar situation as that Worlds event, because back at that Worlds, Regidrago was the clear contender as the best deck in the format, and the meta was very centered about either playing Regidrago or finding a way to beat it. Last year Worlds was a little bit more open. There were multiple contenders for decks that were really strong with Goldango, Gardevoir, Charizard, Dragapult, and now we're kind of back to, hey, Dragapult is the clear contender as the best deck in the format. You're either playing it or you're playing a deck that can beat it for the most part. And I think when that's the case, I think it kind of opens up the doors for some other decks to do really well, and we currently have a lot of really good single prize decks. Last year at Worlds, when you look at all the people that made day 2 at Worlds, there were 0 single prize decks that actually made it. And I had to double check this, and unless I'm seeing something wrong here, I don't see any single prize decks. And then when I think back to last year, there really weren't any single prize decks that were really good. The closest we get is 130th place with Crustle, which is a deck that is technically a single prize deck, and it's just kind of its own category, I feel like. But when you look back at the past decade, ever since Night March was a thing, there really haven't been a lot of clear single prize decks that had a chance to actually win a World Championships. I'd say the two in most recent history that were kind of best positioned were probably Ancient Box from a few years ago, but this is always a deck that kind of felt like it didn't really have the power to contend with those EX decks like Charizard and stuff like that. And aside from that, the only other single prize deck in recent history that I feel like legitimately had a chance to win the World Championships was Lost Zone. Lost Zone was a very powerful single prize deck. It did include a lot of 2 prize attackers in certain builds of it, but there were a lot of different ways to play it, and it always felt like it had a chance to compete at the higher levels. I mean, for a while it was one of the best decks in the format, but it unfortunately never managed to actually win the World Championships. But as we go into Worlds this month, I'd say there are 3 well-positioned single prize decks that have a chance to make some noise at Worlds and potentially win the entire event. And when you look at the cards that came out in Pitch Black, it really kind of helped all 3 of these decks. There are cards from Pitch Black that really kind of just boosted each of these decks' chances. When you look at what they can do in the current meta, they have a shot to compete, they have a shot to win the World Championships, and I think this year it might actually happen. Now, the first deck to talk about here is Alakazam. Alakazam is a deck that historically has struggled with Dragapult because of the spread damage of Dragapult. Now, early builds of Alakazam typically rely on Battle Cage to help protect the bench, but there were still weaknesses behind that as far as Dragapult being able to just bump your stadium, wipe your board, unfair stamp you, red cards in the format as well now, so hand disruption, plus bumping the stadium typically can destroy Alakazam. Aside from that, Alakazam doesn't do damage to opponents, it actually places damage counters, which means that there are abilities in Pokemon that are in certain decks that basically just auto win against Alakazam. Alakazam can't really do much against them. But that's where the new card Toucannon definitely helps out. It's a built-in draw engine, a card that allows you to draw an extra card every single turn, and it's got a very powerful attack which does 60 damage plus 20 more for each bench Pokemon, yours and your opponent's. So essentially with Toucannon, we now have an attacker that can beat those auto loss matchups, and we also get some extra draw power to help boost our consistency, to help kind of get us over the edge. There are a lot of situations where you may be 1 or 2 cards short. Toucannon can help you get there. Now on paper, Alakazam definitely still struggles with Dragapult. Like, we are either relying on Battle Cage, Nighttime Mine, Handheld Fan. We have different ways to deal with Dragapult. The question is, do you build your version of Alakazam to be more focused on beating Dragapult, or do you build it to kind of be better into other matchups? You can still kind of play the control build of Alakazam, which deals specifically with Dragapult, or you can focus on a build that kind of relies a little bit heavier on Toucannon and just kind of being better into the general field. I think Toucannon is kind of that missing piece to the deck that really allows you to have a chance into everything, a good chance for the most part. You're a single prize deck with multiple attackers at a pretty decent amount of HP. You've got so many ways to draw cards now. You have ways to deal with these auto loss matchups. And what's really nice about a deck like this is that you have the ability to just pop off early on. You've got rare candies, you've got the ability to hit for crazy high numbers, basically unlimited damage depending on how many cards you have in hand. And that's going to be really good into a lot of different decks like Zoroark, decks like Mega Excadrill. There's a lot of decks with these 2-3 prize Pokemon that you can just one-shot, and you're going to always win that prize trade. Before before Pitch Black, your biggest struggles were definitely Dragon Bolt, and then all these auto loss matchups like Team Rocket's Mewtwo, Honchkrow, that kind of stuff. And now with Toucannon, we've kind of narrowed it down to just Dragapult, but again, we do have ways to beat Dragapult. We just have to kind of plan around it and play smart. And Alakazam is in a similar spot to this next deck, which is Festival Lead, another deck that is a single prize deck, which is very, very powerful. And I'd say honestly, out of all 3 single prize decks, I think this one is best positioned to actually win Worlds. And that's because, again, you pretty much beat everything except for Dragapult. But I do think that between like Festival Lead and Alakazam, you kind of have a better shot into Dragapult than Alakazam, I would say. With this deck, you basically have a built-in search for any card that you want to, search for any 2 cards you want to, 3 cards, depending on how many Thwackies you have on your bench. And now with the new Gladion card from Pitch Black, you have the ability to knock out essentially anything. Sometimes late in the game, it can be really hard to reestablish Applins, especially if you don't have a Rapska on your bench. But now you can put down a Goldeen, which has that extra 10 HP, which you'd be surprised it actually helps out a lot. And that's because Seeking can actually one-shot Dragapult with Brave Bengal and Gladion. I think Gladion helps in so many different ways, and it's honestly not that hard to pull off. You would think like you have to discard your whole hand. It might be kind of hard to pull off, but a lot of times you're in a pretty good spot, especially if you have your Thwackies down. Thwackies don't really get stuck too often if you really prioritize getting your air balloons on them. And to be honest, what I've really noticed in the Dragapult matchup is that things like Unfair Stamp and Red Card really don't hurt you nearly as much as they used to, because essentially what your opponent is doing is putting you down to a low hand size, and by that point in the game, that's kind of when you want to be going for Gladion, so a lot of times they're actually really just helping you. If they Unfair Stamp you to a 2-card hand and then you draw your card for turn, you have 3 cards in hand, just go search out an Ultra Ball, get rid of another card in your hand, and you're pretty much good to go. This deck is great into all the dark decks like Zoroark, like Grimmsnarl, which are both kind of rising in popularity. These are both decks that are there to kind of counter Dragapult. And so again, when you look at the meta as a whole, if Dragapult's going to be the main deck, Zoroark's going to beat there. Zoroarks are beating Dragapults. That means there's more Zoroarks at the top tables. Festival League can kind of sneak its way in there. It's not an all-or-loss matchup into Dragapult. You definitely have a shot to beat Dragapult, and if you can do that, you're in a great spot. We've seen in the past how powerful a search for any card ability is in a deck. You know, you look back at Charizard with Pidgeot having quick search, very strong ability, and the fact that you have multiple with Wacky is just kind of insane. I think this deck really has all the tools, and people have said it, like if Dragapult wasn't a thing, this would by far be the best deck in the format, and I definitely agree with that. But this isn't the only single prize deck that has a chance to win Worlds. We have to also talk about Slowking, and out of the 3 decks, this one probably has the best, well, not probably, it does have the best Dragapult matchup. Now, what's interesting with this deck is that it didn't get a whole lot with Pitch Black, but I do think it definitely benefits from Pitch Black in other ways. Really, the only new card that it got was this new Annihilate, which hits the active for 100 and puts 50 damage on the bench. This is a great option to deal with things like Festival League because you can hit the active and put 50 on an Applin to still get 2 knockouts if they have Shaman on their bench. The other option to kind of deal with Festival League will be this Mega Slowbro, where basically if they hit it, they knock themselves out. So that's another option, but it's kind of only for Festival League. But the reason why I think this deck benefits from Pitch Black is because there's new decks in the format. Most notably, I would say Excadrill. And I think what it does is it kind of shifts the focus onto some of these other decks. So it really kind of makes people not consider putting Shaman in their deck. I mean, we've kind of already seen it like at NAIC, where a lot of people just aren't really respecting these types of decks to put Shaman into their list, because Shaman is a dead card unless you need it for a certain matchup. So would you really want to go through your day playing against all these Dragapults with a 59 card deck? Not really, so a lot of people just decide to cut Shaman. And so when you introduce even more decks like Mega Excadrill, decks that don't really have that bench damage, it kind of like, again, focuses the focus on somewhere else away from Slowking. So I think more people would decide not to play Shaman in the list. It really kind of comes down to, do you respect Slowking or not? I think a lot of people will not respect Slowking, and I think that really helps out Slowking, because if they don't have Shaman in their list, it makes the matchup much better for Slowking. Even if they do play it, we do still have stuff in the list like Clefairy to be able to one-shot Dragapult, and again, we are attacking with single prizers, so it kind of forces our opponent to boss around the single prizers or deal with them in different ways. But Shaman is really kind of only a problem when it's in Dragapult, and that's just because it makes it more annoying and a little bit harder to win. When Shaman is in like Festival Lead or Alakazam or stuff like that, we do have the new Annihilate to kind of deal with it and be able to hit these low HP Pokemon on the bench like Abras or like Applins or Goldeens. And this deck is so strange to look at, like the way that it's constructed, like it takes some practice to actually get used to playing it for sure, but it's very powerful. You have attackers to deal with anything, and you can basically choose what attackers you want to include within your deck. We've got multiple different Annihilates now, which do different things for different matchups. We've got the Metagross, which hits for 300. We've got the Kyurem, which spreads 110 on 3 Pokemon. We've even got the the Zero Aura, which can hit a benched EX Pokemon for 210, knocking stuff out like Fezandipity or Meowth. So this deck really has it all. Really the big problems with this one is, does your opponent play Shaman, and can I get set up? But out of all the single prize decks, this deck can deal with Dragapult the best. It's also got the spread damage to deal with other single prize decks and other decks in the format. Mega Evolution decks aren't really a problem because you can hit for 300 damage. You also have Brave Bengal sometimes. You can even hit with the Annihilate, which knocks out both active Pokemon. So while I personally think that Festival Elite is best positioned to win Worlds, I would not be surprised to see Slowking go a little bit further and actually win Worlds itself. Like I said, if I'm looking at all three single prize decks, I do rank Alakazam at the bottom of the three. It does have a chance to make some noise. I just don't think it has what it takes to actually win Worlds. But I do think that if Festival Elite or Slowking hit the right matchups, they can make a deep run and have a legitimate shot at winning Worlds. In the past, single prize decks have always fallen short because they just don't have what it takes. They're, not doing enough damage, or they lose to spread decks, or whatever the case might be. They just haven't had what it takes to win Worlds in recent years at all. But again, I think right now with how the meta is, it's pretty wide open aside from Dragapult, right? But I do think that there's enough stuff in the meta that kind of opens the doors for some of these decks to have a shot at winning it. And with how a lot of decks are kind of being forced to build around beating Dragapult, it kind of opens up the doors for some of these other decks to beat those decks. And what's crazy is, even though these are the only 3 decks I'm talking about today, there are other single prize decks out there that are still really solid decks going into Worlds. You talk about Crustle, you talk about Hide and Sneak, Team Rocket's Honchkrow, right? These are all decks that I feel like are kind of towards the bottom of the tier list, but they're still competitively viable. Can't say that word. Competitively. And they do have a shot at making deep run, top 32, top 64. I just don't think those decks really have what it takes to actually win Worlds. Alakazam barely makes the list here, but I could see it depending on what people come up with. Let me know what you guys think, though. I'm excited for Worlds. I'm excited to see some of the meta shake up here a little bit. Dragapult is fun. I love the deck, but I do always like seeing the variety. And if you guys have any thoughts on Worlds, let me know in the comments. I love having a discussion back and forth. I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. And again, thank you guys for supporting the channel. Hope you have a good one, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.